You're listening to the Faith Made Welcome podcast, a progressive podcast of faith where we look at Christianity from a progressive Baptist tradition. This podcast is brought to you by Commonwealth Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. So whoever you are, wherever you are, or whatever you think about faith, you're welcome here. Please let us know what you think about our podcast by subscribing to it or by sharing it with someone who may be looking for a podcast like this. And we would love to hear your feedback. So please leave us a comment or question on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. Let's get started.
Ready. Okay. So, welcome to Faith Made Welcome, episode 2. We have different folks, sort of, in the room today. So, who do we have with us today?
Pastor Robin, one of the pastors at Commonwealth Baptist Church.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm back again, another pastor at Commonwealth Baptist Church.
And I'm still Cheri Spiegel, not a pastor at Commonwealth Baptist Church. But we also have...
I am Courtney Hodge, and I am the coordinator for religious education for Commonwealth Baptist Church. Also not a minister, not a pastor.
But...
Not yet.
But we're working on it.
We're working on that.
Yeah. But we still sometimes get to hear Courtney preach, and it's magical.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That it is.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I do preach.
Yeah. So, cool. Well, we are here to talk about the second episode in our church's series on, my mind just totally blanked on the name of the service.
The Activist Preacher Series.
That part I got.
What the world needs now is ...
Yes. For some reason, I keep wanting to call it the All You Need Is. It's a little more of a John Lennon vibe. So, for folks that maybe haven't done their homework and didn't listen to the sermon this week, shall we tell them a little bit about what the sermon was about?
Well, this week, the sermon's topic was about what the world needs now is a new covenant, which was an intriguing title to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the world needs a new covenant. Cool. Shall we say a little bit about who our preacher was?
Yes. Our preacher was Sanja Jha, who is a Disciples of Christ minister and activist out in Oakland, California. She has written numerous books. I know that she has one that just came out. She runs the Oakland Peace Center. I know that a good deal of her work has to do with anti-racism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love on her website, she has sort of like this subtitle about herself where she describes herself as wonk, activist, and arbiter of hope. And so I think that's really cool. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So she's calling for a new covenant. How does that come about? Like, where's she coming from on that?
We can start with her scripture. The scripture passage that she used is from Psalm 103. Mm-hmm. And that, the verses that she reads verses 15 through 18, I think. And that calls for... It says that God's love is everlasting and will be, God's grace and love will be passed on to not only the people who love God, but their children and their children's children. And the people that it talks about God keeping covenant with are those who keep covenant with God and those who remember God's commandments. Mm-hmm. So she begins her sermon by talking a good bit about what is covenant. What does that mean to keep covenant?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like, she kind of spends a little time thinking about her own relationship to the idea of covenant, and even talking about early church work where she wants to get sort of like, settled into her first church work job, and she's like, why are we talking about it as a contract? Why don't we talk about it as a covenant? And I think covenant's kind of a weird word to me. Like, isn't covenant kind of like high church? Like, how do y'all think about what is a covenant?
I don't know. For me, covenant reminds me that both parties are invested in it working out well, and not to the point of like when you're talking about a contract, both parties agree to just do something for whatever reason. Like you're just engaging in the contract. It's more, for following rules, legality, and things like that. But for me, a covenant is like, it's more intimate than that. It's like, for my well-being, for your well-being, we're going to enter into this covenant. And so when I think about covenant, I think about marriage. And so like a marriage being a covenant, not necessarily a contract to be fulfilled, but more so like trying to align, your spiritual, emotional goals together. So like, that's what I think of when I think of a covenant. And I think that's the difference for me between a covenant and a contract.
Yeah, because a contract, you lay down the terms, and then our natural tendency is to like try to find the loopholes in that contract so we can get the most out of it, right? But with a covenant, it's kind of the opposite. We're trying to get out of the way. That's what's keeping us from entering into a relationship. So I guess that's kind of a difference in the contract and covenant.
I think one thing I would add to that is that a contract has an element of protection, right? That we put some things in place so that I am protected from you finding the loopholes in the contract. Whereas a covenant, if I think of covenant in biblical terms, I feel like covenant is rooted in trust as opposed to distrust.
Right. Like, it seems to me that contracts assume the worst in people, right? And then...
Yeah, their intentions are worse. Like, because we have to have a contract because I don't trust you.
Right, exactly. So we're gonna develop a contract. It's a protection. But I don't think of covenants as protection.
And you saying that contracts assume the worst in the other person, that kind of puts a spin there on God repeatedly making covenants with humanity in Scripture. I mean, there's this element that God keeps assuming the best in humanity, and we keep screwing it up. Right. And so God ends up making more than one covenant. We start with Noah, that there's the covenant after the flood, and then God establishes a covenant with Abram and Sarai, and then that covenant gets extended onto their descendants. And then later we have the 10 Commandments when the Hebrew people are wandering through the wilderness. We've got a covenant with David, and then the prophets keep saying there's going to be a new covenant, there's going to be a new covenant. And then we've got Jesus, and those of us who are non-Jewish are brought into the covenant. So there is kind of almost a sadness if you think about it. If we think of it as God assuming the best in humanity, and then we just mess it up over and over and over again.
Right. And we clearly don't assume the best in each other, right? That's why we're like knee deep in contracts all the time. Like, oh, yeah, I'd like to do something with you, but we're going to need a prenup. We're going to need a contract. Yeah.
Right. I don't know. I think about it too in terms of like us being God's children, and just like new covenants that I make with my son Eli, right? And so it's not just about him, messing things up, but it's about my expectations changing. Over time, I have different expectations of him as he grows. And so as we grow as the children of God, I think God changes up what the expectations are like, look, when we first started out, we're going to have rules about, eating and all of this stuff. But now it's like, hey, let's work on rules about like how we treat each other. And so it's kind of like, I take it to be like, yes, in part, we are messing things up and we need to readjust. But also in part, like, I think God's expectations of us are changing as we develop relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting because I was listening to somebody talk about covenant, and he talked about the covenant with Abraham, told him that he was going to bless him, his family, and the land.
Mm-hmm.
And this land aspect is kind of like goes throughout the Old Testament. But when Jesus came along, it was like Courtney was saying, the expectation has changed, and the good news of what God is trying to do expanded to include other people and their lands and their communities. And it's kind of this inclusion when we flip over to the New Testament. So you see this wave of God trying to relate to us through covenant throughout the Bible.
Bringing more people in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That, what both of y'all are saying makes me think about my, I think, favorite passage in the New Testament outside of, I guess, the Gospels would be safe to say, is the story in Acts when Jesus calls Cornelius, and, you know, he's a Gentile. And then Peter is on the roof of a house, and he has this vision where God is this cloth comes down in his vision, and there's all of these animals that aren't kosher to eat. And God says, eat. And Peter, very faithfully and devoutly says, by no means, Lord, I'm not going to eat the unkosher food. And God is saying, no, eat. And he's saying, by no means, I'm not going to eat the kosher, the food that's not kosher. And then Cornelius's servants knock on the door and tell Peter about this Gentile who knows Jesus, and Peter goes. And so there's this, that story isn't necessarily about covenant, but it is a story about God expanding the welcome, right? And I think that connects with what you were saying, Courtney, about God's expectations changing. Like maybe we as humanity are ready for the next step. And that's what I sense that Sandra is talking about in her sermon with the new covenant, is that we as people we're ready for more. And so God has higher expectations for us, and we should have higher expectations for ourselves and for one another to continue that expanding.
That story's in Acts chapter 10, just in case y'all need a reference, because I got beat last week in the Bible drill. So.
Marty's redemption story.
There's my redemption right there.
Yes. Okay. Marty won the Bible drill this week. Though the rest of us didn't know we were playing.
This story is actually told twice in Acts. That's how important it is. Do you remember where the second reference is? I think it's 14, but I might be wrong.
I don't know. Where's the Bible? I'm just kidding. Let's keep going.
I got a hymnal. So we were thinking a little bit about her sermon and how the sort of why she's calling for a new covenant. And a lot of it is very, like we've thought about this a lot in terms of like Jesus and the Old Testament stories and the New Testament stories. But she locates it very directly within the United States. And she spends a lot of time thinking about how we got here, like in terms of like America and its founding and principles that went into setting up our government, and then understanding where we are and recognizing the need for religious liberty. She calls for a new covenant. So what's happening there? Like what's her critique or what are our critiques, I guess, of like where we are as not necessarily as a country, but to some extent, like, why do we need a new covenant in this country? Softball question number 1.
Well, it goes back to like what we were talking about, contract versus covenant. And now we kind of see the Constitution as this contract, and we try to get the most out of it because we don't trust people to respect our rights. And I think what she's saying is that we need to rewrite the Constitution as it is as a covenant, so that we enter into a relationship so that everybody has the equal rights and benefits, and the whole system works for everybody. That's what we've been longing for, and that's what some people say this country's built upon. And but yeah, I think that's where she's kind of getting this idea from. It's like, the contract is going back to, this safeguards me from anything you can do to me. And I think she's trying to say, well, if it's a constitution for our country, then every citizen should benefit from it. It should be a relationship.
Right.
She also references the documentary 13. And that highlights the loophole, right? You talked about there being loopholes in contracts.
Yeah.
And so that clause in the 13th Amendment about that the freedoms are granted to those who are not
criminals.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
That loophole has opened the door to a great deal of injustice coming out of an amendment that, in theory, on the surface, you would think was supposed to grant freedom.
Yeah, and the other thing about the 13th was that idea that they kept renaming racism.
Uh-huh.
They kept renaming it. Like, it was first, they kept renaming, like, black people couldn't vote, and when they could, you could only do it if you weren't a criminal, and they kept renaming how they were going to do the loophole.
Uh-huh.
Which was kind of eye-opening to me a little bit. Like, we keep renaming our problem and not dealing with our problem.
Uh-huh. Well, and I think that, that's what, there's something about the power of words to help us to sidestep what actually are the problems.
Yeah, I think contracts kind of get into like the words of something. All right, these are the words that are said. Covenant, I think, gets to like what's the intent behind it, right? And following through with that intent. And it's kind of like this thing where, all right, we're forced by contract to end slavery, but we're not adhering to the intention of that. But what we're going to do is, okay, well, we're not going to have slaves, but we're going to have sharecroppers, and we're not going to pay you very much. And so it's going to be basically the same, but we're going to call it something different. Okay, so everybody has to vote. Well, fine. Everybody can vote, but only if your grandfather has voted before. And so, like, we just find ways to try to, not follow the intent of it, but just follow the word of it. And that's where I think, she's getting at when she's talking about covenant. Like, covenant is so much deeper than the words. It goes to the intent, because we just find different ways to just display racism. We just call it different names.
Mm-hmm. There's an interesting way where a lot of this, I think, connects into issues related to hierarchy. And when I was listening to her preach, I kept thinking about Octavia Butler has this novel, Dawn, which is like one of my favorite books in the world. And in it, it's a sci-fi novel, but in this novel, humans have basically all but destroyed themselves. And these aliens, again, sci-fi. So the aliens come and they're trying to save the humans, and they basically identify something that they think is ultimately like the toxic element about humanity. And that toxic element is that we are both hierarchical and intelligent. And they think that we can have one or the other, but not both. And so for Octavia Butler, this is like her like warning to humanity in a lot of ways, is that it is our tendency for hierarchy that actually destroys us. It's that combination of that and intellect. And I see that a little bit in how we insist upon contracts, in part, maybe, or we're drawn to them because we're hierarchical. We can't believe everyone's sort of equal. We're always developing these tiers of humanity. And I think if you look in how our government is set up, there's hierarchy in everything that we do, right? And so, I don't know. I've thought a lot about how hierarchy contributes to some of the problems that sort of started with, the founding of our country, ultimately.
And protecting our spot in the hierarchy.
Yes.
Right? So you don't want to be, even if you're not on the top rung of the ladder, at the very least you can keep yourself from being knocked down to a lower rung on the ladder.
Right.
Which is often why white women will align themselves with white patriarchy,
mm-hmm.
as opposed to aligning themselves with black women.
Right.
That we will sacrifice, right, our own well-being as women for fear that we might lose our place on the ladder.
Right. The danger of white lady tears,
mm-hmm.
right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which I guess, goes back to this connection of covenant and trust. That if we're going to create covenant with one another, we've got to be invested in each other's lives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about covenant because I think one of the first steps of covenant is actually caring about the other parties and their well-being. And it's funny. Okay, so I have a pop culture reference.
Yes.
So I'm a fan of Grey's Anatomy. Been watching Grey's Anatomy since the very beginning. And there's a couple in Grey's Anatomy, April and Jackson. And Jackson's wealthy, and so they had a prenup. And the relationship doesn't work out, so they're ending up going through a divorce, and they're having a hard time. But then they remember the prenup, and not just like what was in the prenup, but why the prenup was written. Because like Jackson says, this prenup was written by two people who loved each other, who wanted to protect each other if anything went awry. And so, like even in that contract, their intent to not protect themselves, but to protect the other, I think made a difference in what that was. It was more of a covenant than just a contract. And so I think it really does go down to like, you actually have to care about the other before you enter into a covenant. But for us, I feel like what's happened is our contracts are based on a flawed system. And so we might have to start with some contractual negotiations before we can get to the covenant part. But like it's based on a system that was designed to marginalize. And so when you're working from a flawed system, you often get flawed products. And this is what we're seeing that's just coming to a head. It's just like, it's the response to a flawed system in the first place, building laws in a country on a flawed system.
We're making me think about how contracts can be written in a way to protect. Like you're talking about this one prenup that is in Grey's Anatomy. Isn't the contract that is signed at a Jewish wedding, the ketubah? Isn't that essentially a contract that essentially protects the woman if a wedding dissolves? Because historically, women had no property, no rights outside from the husband. And so this contract is signed as a protection so that if the marriage dissolves, she is not left with nothing.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about when we have so that's kind of an example of a contract designed to protect. I don't know why I'm thinking. So we have at our church, we have a church covenant, right?
We do.
So, but we don't have a church contract. We have a church covenant. So, what's the deal with our church covenant?
So our church covenant essentially says that we are going to commit to trying to live as community of faith. It says, trusting that we've been brought by divine grace to embrace the Lord Jesus Christ. We now solemnly covenant with each other that we're going to seek first the kingdom of heaven and God's righteousness. And then it lists ways that we are going to try and live that out. And so, we are going to care for each other and look out for one another. We're going to nurture our spiritual formation, right? We're going to practice worship. We're going to pray. We're going to study. We're going to participate in each other's lives, whether that's like sharing joys together, whether that's, being with each other when somebody's having a really hard time. So right there, right? That's covenant. We're promising that we're going to be invested in each other's lives, not just come sit in the same space together or watch the same thing together. So we commit to investing in the life of the church, right? We're going to give our time. We're going to share our talents. We're going to give money to help fund and keep the ministry of this church, this community going. That we're going to try our very best to love each other regardless of our differences, whether those are political differences, racial, gender, socioeconomic, that we're gonna try to kind of get off the ladder, set aside the hierarchy, and love each other with the good, the bad, and the ugly.
I think that's kind of like the backbone of our church, is trying to be inclusive, even though I would say theologically we're all over the spectrum in our church, right? But we come in and we have these ideas and we talk, and like I said before, nobody really questions people's intentions about it, and that's how we can get out of the way of saying, I need a contract to protect myself of you. I can enter into covenant and try to grow with you, is a kind of what our covenant's kind of about.
But I think that even in our church, that has been a process.
It has.
We've talked about this revelation, this ongoing process and expectation, because, the church, was that 15 years ago, officially made the decision to become open and affirming. So it's, that was a step for the church. The church had a female pastor in the 90s, which was way before any Baptist had a female pastor, had a woman pastor.
Right.
And that, I'm sure, was a step. Now we have committed ourselves to doing the work to try to become as solidly anti-racist as we are open and affirming of those who are LGBTQAI. And that, again, has been and continues to be a process.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I like about our church covenant is, well, one, I think it aims to be inclusive. I in particular like that we use a lot of we language instead of a lot of you language. So it's not like, as a member of this church, you will behave this way, you will do this. It is, here's who we are, here's what we're going to try and do in community. But I also seem to understand it as it's an evolving covenant in a lot of ways. Like, this is, we, a bunch of flawed people, will come together and try to do some of this work together. And this is who we want to be together, is kind of how I see the church covenant.
Yeah, I think when you're talking about covenants and you're talking about contracts and what you just mentioned, Cheri, about like the do's and don't do's, like it's so contractual. I feel like a contract is more like about behavioral alignment, right? A covenant is more about character alignment. And so what you're trying to do in a contract is like, hey, look, these are the rules, just follow them. But for character alignment, you're looking at, all right, these are our values. These are the things that we hold as important, and this is why we adhere to them. And I think actually, this shift is really interesting because I've been reading a lot about parenting because, that's the thing I do. And like they're talking about, I watched this parenting video and they were like, why discipline has changed over time. And it's like, well, now we're making it important for kids to have a voice. And so like, you can't just focus on like behavioral alignment with kids. You actually have to work on teaching them some ethics and like why we do the things that we do, because there's been a shift. And I feel like this shift is maybe being felt also like in a larger society, that like, we've got to get to the why we do these things. Why is it important to have equality for all? Why do we need to change the way we view other people? Because like behavioral correction is not enough. People just learn to hide their bad behaviors. So we have to work on that character alignment. Now, behavioral alignment is good while you're working on the character alignment, but yes, the goal is character alignment, not behavioral alignment.
I'm glad that you said that second part, Courtney, because I think that one thing that white Christians often fall back on when we're talking about the hard stuff, like you'll hear the little phrase like, we don't have a skin problem, we have a sin problem. Or things aren't going to change unless you change the heart. And on the deepest level, like you're saying, on the deepest level, that's true, right? We can pass laws for equality and people can refuse to bake the wedding cakes and go to court and try and find the loopholes. And so if hearts aren't changed, if the ethics and the inside isn't changed, the laws, the Constitution, the contracts won't necessarily work. Yet, the flip side of that is we can't use this whole, it's all got to come from the heart as an excuse to never make the right changes. Mm-hmm. So there's both, right? Like, we as a society need the new Constitution. Mm-hmm. Yet we as people of faith need to engage in the hard work to, one, push for the new Constitution, the things that need to change, but also to be invested in them on like a deep level, right? Mm-hmm. We need to be transformed as society transforms, right?
Yeah,
that's
and I
the
think
spiritual formation we talked about last week. Sorry, Courtney, go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's fine. Sorry, I was interrupting. And I think that goes back to like when I was in seminary, my professor of Old Testament talked to us about lenses, and that everybody views the Bible through a certain lens and try to understand what your lens is. And my lens has always been, what I realized was love the Lord your God with all your might, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So that's my lens. That's what like my faith is all about. And so it reminds me of like what we're talking about now. It's like, but before we got there, we had the 10 Commandments. Just rules. Just rules. That's what we had. You start with rules and then you work on that. So like it's not just because we understand that, like, until the character changes, you can't really always adhere to the behavior wholeheartedly, doesn't mean that we're not going to work on the behavior, because that's just, in my way, that's just cop out. That's a cop out. Yeah. It's like, oh, well, we just got to wait. We got to pray. And like, you wait, you pray, like, people don't change just like one day they wake up, you know what? I think everybody should have the same rights as I have, and I'm going to go and fight for that. Like, sometimes it's rules and understanding and trying to adhere to a bigger picture. And then that works in to some people understanding, okay, I see how this benefits. I see why this is a good thing. And then character alignment can change as well.
And along with that, with the rules also comes education. That's making me think about 13th again. And, there were parts of that history that I knew. I knew that private prisons are making a lot of money. And so there's economic benefit to having lots of people in prisons. I did not, however, realize that it is also economics that is now suddenly driving the movement to not have so many people in prisons. Like, I thought, oh, we're getting enlightened and we're realizing that people shouldn't be in jail necessarily because they sold some pot. I did not realize that there are people who are invested in making a whole lot of money and basically imprisoning people in their homes by making them wear expensive ankle bracelets. So it's the same thing, just repackaged. And so it's important for me to know that, right? I think the final gut punch in that documentary is when Brian Stevenson at the very end is saying, if you asked yourself what you would do if you were alive during the civil rights movement, if you asked yourself what you would do if you were alive during slavery, if you asked yourself what you would have done if you were alive during Jim Crow and lynchings and all this kind of stuff, what are you doing now? Mm-hmm. Because it's the same thing. It's just packaged differently. So part of it is education so that we're not fooled into supporting those loopholes that prevent everyone from having justice, right? Some people can have good motives, but just be ignorant. And that's, right? That's,
yeah.
I think I'm not pointing that at other folks.
And I think growing up in Mississippi, I was always educated on the behavior. Uh-huh. and the values came later, which we were talking about. But the being educated on, you don't drink, don't smoke, don't do this, don't do that, all those rules,
The shouldn't, shouldn't.
shouldn't, they became blurred with values. So all you had to reference if you saw injustice, you only had to reference is, well, what can I not do to still be in good lining with God and my faith and everything else?
Mm-hmm.
And so the value got lost. Like,
that also has to do with white American Christianity making faith so stinking individualized.
Yep.
Right? If it is just about me doing the right things to have my personal salvation protected, then I don't have to worry about what's happening out there. That's also how we can, missionaries can go into places and just preach and not think about fixing that's still imperialistic. Lifting up communities to help fix, right? The systems that are broken. It doesn't matter if you're starving. If I can tell you about Jesus, you can have salvation.
Yeah. Which is it's so interesting because, like, if we think about, like, well, the actual Jesus program, right? Like, that's so weird to even think about. Like, before we started recording this, I was looking at something by Richard Rohr, who we all love, I think. And Richard Rohr talks about the social program, is what he calls it, that Jesus advocated for, which he says was based on communion, friendship, distribution, and partnership. And so, like, the idea that, like, we can go in and just tell people about Jesus. Are we telling people about the fullness of Jesus, or are we telling them about a very personal Jesus, which is a strange song reference to make. But anyway, but yeah, like, I just, like, the Jesus program is a lot more than just a personal savior. There's a lot of equity and justice built within him. And so Richard Rohr talks about his version of the covenant idea is about contribution, responsibility, and care that works both ways in the context of equity and mutual respect. So for Richard Rohr, that's the Jesus message. But that's not always the Jesus message that missionaries
what were
bring.
the three things again?
The three things.
Covenant.
Contribution, responsibility, and care work both ways in the context of equity and mutual respect.
That's interesting. If you put that in the context of your personal relationship with God, it has to work both ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing how God ever kept pursuing us.
That's why there's so many stinking covenants.
Because it usually never works both ways, right? It's been working one way for a long time. Yeah. Oh, man.
It's a testament to God's love.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think. And also an encouragement for us to continue the work.
Yes. And not necessarily beat ourselves up for there being a learning curve.
Right.
Right. That we're,
And it's also good for our church to hear this, to be reminded that we are living in a covenant, that it works both ways.
And to think of the responsibility of that covenant, right? There's covenant with God. There's covenant with us as a faith community. But we really should be expanding that to covenant with our community and covenant really with all of humankind. Mm-hmm. And you said the word mutual or mutuality. Like mutuality
mutual respect,
that's key. That's key right there, right? That's what gets us off of the hierarchical ladder. That there's mutual respect where everybody's got everybody's contributing, right? Everybody's got, not just that everyone needs to contribute, but everyone has gifts and knowledge to contribute. And we're all less whole without that.
Right. Well, and that's actually, it's funny you say that, because that's actually where Richard Rohr goes next in this passage. He says, all persons are respected equally, while particular gifts and expertise organize collective activity appropriate for the benefit of all. And so it's like mutual respect, but different talents. But it's not because any one set of talents is like the good set. It's because, I mean, y'all, we're a mess. It's going to take all hands on deck, right? Yeah. But I really like the fact that he emphasizes so much the benefit of all, because I don't think that's necessarily always our default setting. Is we really wake up every morning and say, okay, what God is calling me to is benefit for all. How do I live that out today?
Most people are like, how do I get through this day, God?
Right.
That's the prayer.
Please let me survive.
Yeah.
But what you just said is the kingdom of God.
Right.
Right? What you just described.
That prayer was kingdom of
is
God.
how the kingdom of God comes about. And my belief is that God's covenant will be fully realized when there is the kingdom of God on earth. So that's ultimately what we as people of faith should be striving for. Like what you asked, what we ask in the morning, like that should be it. What's my role in
what's my role in benefit for all today?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I know it seems like so unrelated, but like what God has kind of worked with me on over the past few years is accepting myself as like all the things that I am. So when I was in college, I was in a women's studies class. I never raised my hand. I had nothing to contribute, but I was going to be a good student, a good listener. But my professor decided to call on me one day, and he was asking me, well, what do you think about, some of these issues surrounding women and women's rights? I was like, to be perfectly honest, I have to deal so much with being Black that I don't get time to really think of myself as a woman. And so like I'm combating so many things about being African American that I don't always think of myself as a woman. And so like this is where I think intersectionality has really come into play to talk about just all of my pieces. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about, covenant for all and looking at all these things, that like it is unique to have Black issues, to have lesbian issues, to have issues as a woman, and like they kind of make something just completely unique mm-hmm. to every single one of those individual categories. And so, that's where like I really think I've begun to see like, no, like really all the groups have to be we have to work on all marginalized groups. And so like none of us free until all of us are free.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Another video that by the time this podcast comes out, the church will have heard it because it's going to be part of our service this week, has a little interview with Malcolm Geit, and he talks about the idea of covenanted discomfort. And I think one of the things that just ties in maybe to what you were just talking about, Courtney, is like he's talking a little bit about how when we're in church and we bring all of our differences into the church, like, I think we like to just, stay where what's comfortable and focus on just like what's easy and, who's similar to us and stay in these kind of little pockets. And he's sort of saying that, part of the covenanted discomfort is pushing us beyond those comfort zones and trying to get us to like, look at how do we connect with all the different experiences that are out there. And he specifically says, the liturgy helps us say the hard thing. And I think it's like, for me, it was this image of like reaching across the aisle and starting to look for perspectives that aren't ours and seeing the way that all these things that a person brings to the table are like integrated. And yeah,
we don't, as we're considered a low church tradition, like, and we're like low church at Commonwealth Baptist because we have very little liturgy, and we're not formal at all. And so we don't have, we don't say a creed every week.
Right.
About as far as we get as we say the Lord's Prayer every week. And when we were together, we would pass the peace. Now, a lot of people just greet each other instead of saying the peace be with you and also with you, or our peace and peace of Christ be with you. And I mean, there's something to that, right? If you think about going up to someone that maybe you're having personal conflict with and saying, peace be with you. There's that creates a connection and a bond, right? Or going up to someone whose life experience means that they may not be having peace right now, right? If you think about, our church, let's say when the Obergefell court case was kind of up in the air, right? That caused a whole lot of anxiety in our church. To go to someone and say, peace be with you, when you know that what's going on in their life or their circumstances because of all the pieces of who they are, as Courtney was saying, is causing them a lack of peace, right? That in and of itself is community building and building that mutual care and respect that I can recognize, if I'm mad at you, I don't want you to have peace, but I'm telling you that I do. What does that mean? Or I recognize that your circumstance means that you are not experiencing peace right now, and I wish that for you. That acknowledgement in and of itself is creating mutuality. If I can recognize that circumstances are causing you to not have peace right now, I end up sharing some of that with you. That's how we get empathy, right? We empathize.
And that's in our church covenant, right? Like, we will participate in each other's joys, sure, but we will also bear with compassion and empathy each other's burdens and sorrows. And so I think part of that is the ability to, like, show up and be interested and invested in understanding what the folks in our community bring to the table every time they come to although we don't actually come to tables right now, but you know what I mean.
One day.
Virtually come to the table.
Yes. Yeah.
Actually, it's interesting. Cheri was talking about liturgy, and we're talking about just like everybody's gifts kind of coming together, and it's important for everybody to have their gifts come together. And I think that it's what it brought to my mind is just the elements of our worship, right? So we have the music. We have the call to worship, we have the prayer, we have the sermon, we have the children's sermon, and then we have the benediction, right? And I think all of those play a role, and I have a confession to make. A lot of times I base my children's sermon on the call to worship that Cheri writes, because like it condenses what I know the message is, and then I'm like, all right, I'm gonna pull from this because I have to give a condensed message to the kids and something that's like relatable. And so like they all work together to, and some people might get more out of one than the other, but that's on purpose, right? It's on purpose. It's intentional, that we're using our gifts, humor, creativity, musicality to, work with each other to bring us all closer to what God would have us to be.
I love that. It's interesting this week. I've been writing the calls to worship a little later and later each week lately. Because I can plug them into the sermon at the last minute.
That's okay. Courtney's been doing this. Maybe that's why she's
doing the children's
sermons later and later. She's waiting on you.
I do. I'm like, what am I supposed to talk about?
But it's sometimes, some weeks, it's so interesting how, like, all the pieces just come together anyway. Like, there will be weeks that maybe I don't have a chance to catch up with Robin and Marty and figure out, like, what are they preaching about? And so I just kind of wing it. And then somehow, like, I love it when all the pieces just come together. And so this past week, the call to worship and the whole sermon was about hope. And Ryan, our minister of epic music, I've decided that's his new title.
He's going to freak out to hear a minister in there.
Oh.
Director.
Director of epic music, fine. But like I didn't look at what he was doing in terms of his music either, and it was like an original Ryan song. But the call to worship and his song just talk to each other in this really awesome way. I love it when a plan comes together.
Right, that wasn't actually a plan.
Right.
I love that too.
Well, it doesn't have to be my plan.
Right, God's plan comes together. It's always nice to be a part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Final thoughts, y'all. This has been a great chat.
I've enjoyed my first podcast. That's going to be my thought. This was fun.
Yeah. Well, we enjoyed having you, Courtney.
Well, thank you for having me.
Have you on more podcasts.
Sure, why not?
You give good insight, Courtney.
Yes, indeed. Any final notes? Do we need another Bible drill? Anyone? No? We're good? We're good this week?
No,
Marty
I have
redeemed
ADHD.
himself.
I'm not going to remember all that stuff. I remember the big picture. Love.
Yeah, that seems important. It's one of the big ones. Yeah, I'm always impressed by people that can memorize all that stuff, but the big ideas are what we need. So, next week, we'll do another one, and we'll keep looking at what the world needs now. So, thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This podcast is produced by Cheri Spiegel, Paul Fitzgerald, and This Most Unbelievable Life. For more information, please check us out at www.thismostunbelievablelife.com.